All right, everybody. Welcome back. We apologize. This is a demonstration actually of why these kinds of meetings are so essential. Like we really have to actually show some togetherness in the face of efforts to squelch freedom of speech. And we really appreciate you guys showing some patience and sticking with us. And again, huge apologies to our speaker. And I'll just hand it back over to him. I mean, you were in the middle, Brandon, of this really fascinating explanation of oil politics.
Thank you. Thanks, Cynthia. There were two issues, basically, I think that Russia is able to take advantage of that helps it get its oil to market. One is sort of what I call the nativizing Russian oil, which means blending it with its own, or the Gulf producers blending it with their own oil and then marketing it to Europe and other places in the West. And I think that they've had success there. I think the other thing that they've done, or the other tactic, is they've been able to just offload Russian oil from Russian ships onto ships that are flagged differently, and then they basically sell Russian oil by saying it's oil from somewhere else, which is a tactic that over the years Iran has been able to use with some success. But I think there's one more banal tactic which Russia's been able to take advantage of, which is that a lot of the Gulf oil producers see this as arbitrage. So they're able to buy Russian market at below market prices now. They use Russian oil for domestic reasons and then re-export their own oil to Europe at full market price and sort of profit on the difference. And so I think if we look at the amount of Saudi exports to Europe, they nearly doubled in 2022 oil exports. And I think the Saudis and Kuwaitis and others in the region are able to take advantage, to take good advantage of the situation with Russia and profit from it. And I think that in that way, some of the sanctions against Russian oil haven't perhaps had the bite that many might have expected.
Great. Thank you. So do we have any questions from the audience on Zoom? I have some from the chat.
Folks are going to have to put their questions in the chat today, I think, rather than go back to allowing people to turn their mics on. If anybody wants to raise their hand, if you're somebody that we've certainly had in here before, I can make it so that you can turn your mic on. But I think just for security purposes, it's probably better to have people put questions in chat. And yeah, I do have some notes of what was there before as well, Cynthia, but why don't you go ahead?
Well, Marcia had her very first question in the chat that I think relates to an even larger question, and that is about the agency of protesters in Iran. Again, not to switch to yet a third kind of major issue, but Marcia was wondering about any similarities or differences with Afghanistan. She mentioned that Christiane Amanpour recently interviewed the political leader of the Taliban, and who told her, and of course he's telling a Western journalist who's a woman, but he was telling her that the majority of the Taliban leadership favor at least some movement towards greater rights for women. However, the Kabul Shara and the supreme leader, so the top religious people, don't. And she was wondering if how that situation compares to the one in Iran. And then just to tack onto that, we had a Chinese political scientist here last semester, and we were sort of asking him about his ideas of like individual agency and authoritarian regimes after actually the official session was over. And he said that he thought individuals like in China had the power to like press for specific incremental changes, like say not locking people in their apartments if they test positive for COVID, but he doubted that they had power to actually overthrow the regime. And in your introductory comments, you seem to be saying that, like, you know, these women, these protesters are actually wanting that larger change, not just some kind of incremental, like women can drive now or whatever sort of step. Do you think they can actually affect some kind of transformation?
Sure. So I just want to make the distinction between Iran and Afghanistan for a second. Iran is an Islamic republic, and Afghanistan under the Taliban is also, one could make the argument, a theocracy of sorts. But they're very different in the sense that the Taliban are a Sunni, very ultra-Orthodox interpretation of Islam. It's also very much a tribal society, and the Taliban themselves tend to be very, in terms of social organization, social hierarchies, be very much governed by tribal traditions. Whereas Iran, one of the achievements of the revolution in the Islamic Republic, it's created a very robust set of state institutions, some which are elected, some of which unelected. But they are robust institutions. And I would say one of the big differences between the Islamic Republic, let's say, and Iran under Mohammad Reza Shah, who governed Iran from World War II until 1978, is that the Shah never really institutionalized Iran the way the Islamic Republic has. And so the Islamic Republic has quite a robust set of institutions that neither Afghanistan nor pre-revolution Iran have. And I think that gives, by the way, the Islamic Republic a huge advantage in dealing with these protests and uprisings, because it means that they have a lot more stakeholders who are invested in the system, who have become pillars of those institutions in some sense, and those institutions function in a very clientelistic way, and therefore support a lot of people. And I think that so on the one hand, I think the Islamic Republic is a very different thing from either Afghanistan's Taliban or Iran pre-1978, 79. And it's why I wouldn't underestimate the current regime's ability to weather the current storm. But I do think that the women, and now the greater sense of Iranian society that's been out in the streets and risking their lives, and the lives of their families in many respects, it does have a chance to affect real change. And I don't really find a contradiction in saying both of those things. I think they do want to see the system change in a very 180-degree kind of way. But I think the reality is that perhaps the most realistic thing that we're likely to see is to see the regime and the system of institutions evolve. And that may take a lot of time. But I think that one of the big differences between this protest, and the reason I don't think there's any going back. I think the Iranian society has crossed the point of return with these protests, that the regime won't be able to ignore them. And so I think the protests' ability to affect real change to the system and Iran is here. We're going to just have to wait and see how it plays out. So I hope that answers the question. I think it was a bit of a long-winded answer. My apologies.
No, great.
Cynthia, can you just keep asking questions for the moment? I'm working on getting folks back in.
Oh, sure.
Sorry, thanks.
No. I mean, if the audience has patience, I would like to ask another big question, which is this historical moment here. When we get pessimistic, I think certainly I am prone to wonder if we're in kind of like some sort of exceptional anti-democratic moment. And I look around and I see like Netanyahu, come back in power and appear like quite strong, and as we've been talking about, he's looking to actually use the legislature, which his party controls, to like weaken the Israeli judiciary, right? So he's kind of like an example of a strongman leader. And then in Saudi Arabia, you have someone like Mohammed bin Salman, who is very different from Netanyahu. It's not like they, every single strongman, likes, they like one another. I mean, we know from like World War II that like actually, often great dictators really despise one another. But the leader of Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned earlier, is like incredibly popular amongst the young people. I mean, even though he is a big fan of certain kinds of like technological or scientific change, but he also is into, squelching dissent at home. And we have, Putin in Russia may be looking like weaker than he has been in a long time. But I just sort of wonder, you have all these different countries with very different political traditions, different leaders. I mean, there's no way of explaining this as part of like the same kind of phenomenon. And yet I find myself looking at more and more the rise of kind of popular leaders who favor, limits on democratic power, certainly favor limits on the people's ability to check their own power. And I wonder if, I know it's an amorphous question, I just wonder if you had any insight into that. Sure.
So a couple of things at the outset. As unsettling to many as the Netanyahu government's proposed changes are, I don't think Netanyahu is yet a dictator. And I actually think that Netanyahu tends to be a conservative populist is what I would describe him as. And I think he's playing a very sophisticated political game in Israel, which has a very, how should we say, lively democracy. And I think part of the reason we're seeing some of the things that are going on now in Israel have to do with his own legal cases and the fact that he's being prosecuted in three or four separate cases, and that potentially faces some very serious consequences. But I would say that his ability to connect with certain leaders in the region and outside the region, people like Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, have worked to Israel's national security advantage. And it's something you mentioned earlier, Cynthia. I think that Netanyahu, when he was prime minister for much of the period in which Russia was playing a dominant role in Syria, Netanyahu's relationship with Putin was very important. And I would say even today, as the Israeli government tries to navigate tremendous pressure from the Americans to change its policy towards Ukraine, I think the tightrope that Netanyahu is going to have to walk will be served by his sort of interpersonal relationship with Putin. So in some respects, you could argue that Israel benefits, and I know that some people would take issue with that characterization, from his ability to cultivate relationships with these kinds of rulers, who many might find unsettling, both in our region and outside of our region. I think that those who've been very critical of the prime minister's judicial reform plan have compared the changes to the Israeli system as most resembling those of Viktor Orban's government in Hungary, or perhaps something like Erdogan's government in Turkey. I'm not a legal scholar, and I'm certainly no authority on sort of the transition from democracy to authoritarian rule. So it's hard for me to say which of those analogies works best, or comparatives. I'll say that from my perspective as an Israeli citizen, the thing that I find most troubling, and I'm not a legal scholar, is that we seem to be losing one of our tremendous advantages, which is our very tight sense of social cohesion. And I'd say that in this respect, Israel probably most resembles what's happening in the United States and Europe, is in that we're becoming a much more polarized, the political debate has become much more polarized. The public discourse has sort of devolved into us versus them. And I think what's at stake is really a sense that we're still one nation. And I think that for Israel, a country that faces such tremendous national security threats on a day-to-day basis, losing that sense of social political cohesion is a far greater danger than any one particular change to the system that may or may not happen, and that could be perhaps then undone as well. So from my perspective, it's sort of the mainstreaming what was once marginal, as someone whom I respect very much once said in characterizing what was happening in the US a little bit. I think that applies to Israel as well. And I think we need to be careful about how we conduct our politics so that we don't lose that sense of oneness as a people.
Cynthia, why don't we try to turn to the audience, and Terry, I'll ask
Awesome.
you to unmute. I think you should be able to unmute now. Go
Yes.
ahead.
And also there's a lot of great chat questions too. So please do, if we're
Absolutely.
going to try this, raise your hand. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up briefly on a point that I raised in my leadoff question a long time ago. You've covered most of it, but the one thing I'm not sure you covered was the question whether you've seen a shift in this balancing act between Israel and Russia regarding Ukraine over the past year. And I think it was something of a signal of some kind that Putin shut down or threatened to shut down the Jewish agency in Moscow. And do you see a little bit of, brew going on here and change in the dynamic?
Sure. I think that's how Putin plays politics, right? Sort of the carrot and the stick. And I think that Israel certainly got the message. If we go back a few years, I even remember an incident where there was Israel had extradited a Russian national who was a hacker who was on Israel's territory to the United States. And shortly afterward, just by coincidence, an Israeli backpacker transiting through the Russian airport was taken, was imprisoned on a quite serious charges for smuggling a fairly small amount of cannabis through the Russian airport. And eventually that young woman was released after Netanyahu personally got involved, but it also required Israel to transfer a piece of property in the old city of Jerusalem to Russia that Russia had long asked for. And I think that transactional kind of diplomacy is very characteristic, at least in my limited experience with how Putin conducts affairs. I think that the Jewish agency and Russian Jews are a pressure point, and so Putin knows that, and I think he uses it, and it's a warning to some degree in terms of how Israel is going to manage its relationship, and it's important. I don't want to minimize that issue, but I think when you hear the arguments in the Israeli discourse as to why Israel needs to not come out more strongly for Ukraine against Russia in this war, it's typically framed, the answers from, let's say, the security establishment, the military, it's framed in terms of Israel's national security interests in Syria.
So there have been a couple of questions that have come through in the chat, one before we were interrupted and another now, talking about the relationship between Israel and Turkey. And Marcia had asked before we were interrupted about
Right.
whether Israeli efforts to aid victims of the earthquake have helped bolster that relationship at all. And Ben Rosenberg writes, do you find that Israeli aid to Turkey bolsters their sphere of influence in the region from the perspective of establishing partnerships with surrounding Middle Eastern and Arab nations?
Sure. First, let me say that, for those who don't know, Israel and Turkey have had a rough past under President Erdogan that goes back more than a decade now. And just over the past year, the two countries have renormalized their relationship. I say renormalized, meaning diplomatic ties were never broken, despite the fact that there was a very rocky relationship. In fact, Israeli-Turkish trade never actually was affected. It was quite robust throughout the period in which political ties were really in a crisis mode for several years. But the political situation was really renormalized over the last year. And the peak of that renormalization process is when Turkish intelligence services saved Israeli lives. Iran targeted Israeli citizens on Turkish soil. A campaign where they wanted to assassinate Israelis in response for operations that Iran accused Israel of carrying out on Iranian territory. And Turkey worked very closely with Israel to protect Israeli citizens, uncover the plots against them, which were very real. And this kind of close security services and diplomatic collaboration to protect Israelis on Turkish territory, I think, injected a great degree of confidence in the relationship on both sides. And so I think that the Turkish-Israeli relationship has been quite strong since. However, if we're going to talk about Netanyahu's strong relationship with Putin, it's also, I think, an obligation to talk about Netanyahu and Erdogan's rocky relationship. And so as Netanyahu comes back into office, Netanyahu and Erdogan don't get along. I think that the Israeli response to the earthquake sends the message that in a time of national tragedy, personal relationships don't really matter. What matters is the two people standing side by side. And I think as Israel continues the civil society effort to deliver aid to both Turks and Syrians and Lebanese, I think the message that Israel is trying to send is we want to be on good terms with our neighbors as much as we possibly can. It doesn't always work out that way, and there continue to be probably real differences between the current Turkish government and the current Israeli government, but I think that the message here is that Israelis for years would vacation, in the very areas that were hit hardest by the earthquake, and so there is a great deal of sympathy in Israel for what happened in Turkey. It's in the news nightly, and many Israelis felt the earthquake itself. So I think for us, it's a very real issue, and it's a human issue that almost transcends politics.
Seymour?
Yes,
There we go.
I'd like to go back to the question of disunion in Israel, beyond the left-right divide. Things like B'tah Israel versus everybody else, secular versus religious, Ashkenazi versus Sephardic and Mizrahi, Russian versus German extraction. What is the current state of affairs as far as all of these relations?
So I think, if you want to look for a silver lining in what I was describing in terms of the polarizing debate in Israeli politics, I think what we're all discovering is that sort of the left and right are not as simple and straightforward as we used to think. That even within, let's say, the current governing coalition, there are very big differences, and I would say within the opposition there are also very serious differences. and all of the sort of divides you were mentioning, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, which is Jews who come from Eastern or Muslim lands versus the Jews who come from European origins. I actually think that a lot of the current politics is being driven by a dynamic that we also see in Turkey, which is in Israel for a long time, from the state's founding 1948 until 1977, the country was ruled by a set of elites. And then in 77, those elites were replaced for the first time. And ever since then, we've sort of seen this sort of tug of war over, whose country is it? And I think the reason I compare it to Turkey is Turkey was, ruled by a group of elites following Ataturk. And then gradually, beginning with Erdogan in the early 21st century, it's now been ruled by a different set of elites. And so there's a great sense of, who does the state belong to? Is it us versus them? And it's when you get into who us is and who them is that it gets a lot trickier, right? So it's not just secular and religious. Within the religious camps and even within the Orthodox camps, we're seeing a higher degree of diversity than most people were even aware of. I'll just give you one example. One of the most prominent TV journalists covering the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox sector and his Jewish ultra-Orthodox sector recently came out of the closet online as being gay. And received tremendous support across the political spectrum. And so for many, this would be a hard thing to sort of conceptualize, right? The Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox tend not to be open or encouraging or tolerant of that kind of lifestyle. But here was the journalist who himself is part of that community, publicly making a statement and being supported across the political spectrum for doing so. And it complicates a lot of how we see Israeli society, these kinds of anecdotes. And there are a lot of them here and there. And so I would just say that Israel, as it grows, the population has been growing tremendously, not just amongst the religious and ultra-religious. I think Israel has the highest birth rate of any OECD country. I think Israel, as it grows, becomes a much more diverse society, and we're sort of trying to figure out what that means and how it affects our politics.
Can I go back to the earthquake really quickly and just say that, like, on Russian TV, Russians are really advertising like the amount of aid they're sending, and again trying to work this propaganda line that they help the Middle East, and the US acts only in like very self-interested, like power hungry ways. And so I'm wondering first if you see any indications that, like, in certain countries that kind of propaganda line has traction. I mean, Arab countries, not Israel, I wouldn't expect. But then on the other hand, Russia always has dating back to Soviet times or the era of Boris Yeltsin. I mean, they also have a history of kind of like offering covert support to like both sides in a conflict. And I saw earlier in the chat a question about like any possibility of a second intifada that could be like being like covertly supported by Russia. And obviously this is a hypothetical, but I just wonder, is there any concern like inside the Israeli government that Russia could be trying to say, surreptitiously encourage tensions between Hezbollah and Israel, or between Palestine and Palestinians and Israel, in order to somehow profit from that?
Sure, we've had 5 elections in the last 3 years or 4 years, and I think it's been a concern that Russia might try to interfere and manipulate with our politics, particularly as some of these, when you have election after election, it's clear there's some very serious internal divisions and a polarized debate, which obviously provides an opportunity for those seeking to manipulate it. And I think there is a sense in Israel that not just Russia or Putin, but others may have been trying to take advantage of that situation. And I think there has been some attention given to it. And I think it's probably an ongoing effort. I mean, one of the interesting dynamics is that, Israel has a huge Russian-speaking population, culturally, and an increasingly large Ukrainian-speaking population now, as well as sort of Israel's taken in a significant amount of refugees on both sides. And I think so on one hand, and there are a lot of figures who are close to Putin and Russian elites who maintain Israeli citizenship, and that's also well known, and many of them have a great deal of wealth here in Israel. And have been very generous in Israeli philanthropy as well. So on one hand, I would say Russia and Putin know Israel quite well, and many people who have been close to Putin over the years have a very intimate knowledge of Israel and how it works. And certainly that serves Russia and serves Russian interests. But I would also say that it works the opposite way as well. I think there are a lot of Israelis of Russian background and various degrees of experience with Russia that understand and know how Russia works and understand Russia quite well. And that also, I think, can work to Israel's advantage and has worked to Israel's advantage over the years. So I think it cuts both ways. With respect to propaganda, it's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it, but I'll share this with you. In my conversations, and I every few months have an opportunity to engage with those in our neighborhood from our neighbors.
Hello? Hello?
Who's that talking? Brandon, please go ahead and I'll see if I can deal with this.
All right. So I was just saying, in my opportunities to speak with our neighbors, it surprised me how much sympathy there has been for the Russian argument about the war, or sort of the Russian propaganda line regarding the war, and how critical I found myself listening to the elites from those in the region have been extremely critical towards the West and the West's approach to the Ukraine war. And I understand that that's a line of critique and argument that perhaps has been embraced by those who, I guess, for lack of a better term, refer to the global South, right? And in part, I think it has to do with self-interest. The Middle East has been dramatically affected by the war. It's really reshuffled the cards in a lot of respects, particularly with respect to socioeconomic issues. A country like Egypt with 100 million people is now facing huge food insecurity issues. And it's not just Egypt, Tunisia and many other parts of North Africa are facing similar issues. The knock-on effects of the Ukraine war, things like the potential for sustained global recession, inflation, supply chain challenges, and to say nothing of the fact that potentially the war has the effect to create different blocks and create some kind of different constellation of globalization, is something that scares a lot of people. And so I think when I hear some of these critiques of the West from our neighbors, the way I interpret it is it's fear. It's fear over these dramatic changes that are taking place and how they might affect them, and the fact that they're probably not prepared or equipped to deal with the changes that are happening right now. And so I think that's important to also be mindful of, that You know, when we hear different voices sort of adopting or trumpeting or echoing certain propaganda lines, it may not be because they're so interested in serving the interests of Russia or being critical of the West, but I think they sort of feel disoriented and frustrated by a set of events that's largely outside of their control, but has a very real set of consequences and implications for them.
So we normally end at a quarter after. If the audience can stick around, and if Brandon, if you'd have another maybe 15 minutes for us because we got interrupted, that would be really fantastic. Stan, why don't we ask you to ask your question? You should be able to unmute now.
Okay.
Hey, Stan.
Thank you. Thank you. Brandon, last week, I was listening to a webinar. We had a local area, Washington, D.C. area webinar on Israel and what's going on there. But two speakers, one Israeli, one American, both academic researchers, etc., made an unusual statement. The statement was that they were very confused about, and the fact that Israel really doesn't have a, how should I say, an official policy about Iran. That is, that you can't find a government policy of what is their policy towards Iran. Like you would go to the U.S. State Department site and find out some policies. And it wasn't. And you've explained the Golan, the Syrian issue, and we know Israeli has incursions into Iran occasionally, but maybe you could illuminate us on what is the Israeli policy towards Iran.
It's a really great question, and I'll give you an answer. I think that's interesting. First of all, Iran, sort of like my understanding of China and the U.S. these days, is Iran tends to, particularly amongst, I would say, political elites, generate a great deal of consensus, right? In Israel. It's hard to find a lot of people, sort of political or security or government elites, who don't feel that Iran is Israel's #1 national security threat. I think there's a great deal of consensus on that. On the one hand, I think that's true. On the other hand, with respect to what is Israel's policy, my answer to that would be, you could say, what is Israel's policy on almost any issue? And because we've had such a revolving door of governments over the last few years, we don't have an official policy with respect to a whole range of critical issues. I'll give you another example that I speak about a lot. Is Israel doesn't really have a clear-cut China policy, for example, and Israel's had to face a great deal of pressure from the United States on the question of its relationship with China. And in a range of issues, there are things that Israel does, but there's no coherent or consistent Israel-China policy, and there hasn't been for years. Now, if you're asking what Israel's policy is towards any critical issue, the question, it really comes down to, what does Netanyahu think about it? I mean, he was Israel's prime minister for 10 years, then was out of office for a year and is now back in power. What he thinks Israel's policy is towards an issue has tended to be Israel's policy towards that issue, with one brief exception over the last 13 years. So I would say that Israel's policy is, on the Iranian question, twofold. Iran with a nuclear weapons capability is unacceptable to Israel. And two, Iran's increasing regional expansion is something that needs to be confronted and pushed back on. And that it is in Israel's interests to see, if not regime change in Iran, then a serious policy change.
So there were a couple of different. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Cynthia, please.
I was just the very last question in the chat, I thought
That's
tagged
what I
on
was
to
going to bring
that.
up too. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so would Russia ever give Iran nuclear weapons or nuclear technology?
So Russia has given Iran nuclear technology. The Bushehr power plant was built by Russia,
Of course.
and with Russian expertise and Russian knowledge and Russian maintenance help. And but what's interesting about that story is that Russia really dragged its feet on Bushehr, and the nuclear partnership between Russia and Iran was supposed to be much broader than just Bushehr. But the fact that Iran was increasingly fed up and frustrated with doing business with Russia on the nuclear issue, because Russia was always dragging its feet on it, it made Russia want to look elsewhere, or made Iran want to look elsewhere. One of the questions that I have, and I think Cynthia, I've raised this with you, is now that Iran is becoming a critical weapon supplier to Russia at a time of great Russian need, what's the quid pro quo? What does Iran get in return?
Right.
And what we've read on the public record is that what Iran is getting is the Sukhoi Su-35 fighter jet is supposed to be delivered probably sometime in around March. So Iran, for the first time since the Islamic Republic of Iran was created, will have an air force that's not outdated American fighter jets from the previous regime. And Iranians, if reports are to be believed, are already training on the Sukhoi in Russia right now. And that's a big deal for Israel. The idea with Iran with a real air force, some of Iran's huge developments and gains in the missile development area were because Iran didn't have an air force and really didn't have the planes with which to have an air force. The second area in which Russia is supposedly giving Iran is air defense. The S-400 is supposed to be delivered to Iran. I don't know if that's true, but those are the reports, which would be a serious upgrade and potentially would be a real issue for Israel. To have a sophisticated Russian air defense system like the S-400 in Iranian hands potentially would make life for Israel much more difficult in terms of Israel's ability to deter Iran. And you know, those are the two things that we supposedly do know about. There may be a nuclear dimension that's being renewed as well. I'll say this though, I don't think Russia is particularly keen on seeing Iran with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
It's not far from Russian borders. Again, because of this sort of historical baggage in the relationship that the two countries have, there's not really a great degree of trust. And so it's hard. Again, the Ukraine war is changing a lot of things and forcing us to rethink a lot of things. But I'm not sure that Russia's eager to see Iran become a nuclear weapons power.
We also had a question from Patricia earlier about attitudes toward a Chinese state visit to Iran. And I was just wondering if you had any comments or thoughts about that.
I mean, that could be a game changer, right? Some kind of deepening China-Iranian partnership.
In 2019, when there was serious escalation in the Gulf between Iran and the US, and Iran even shot down a very expensive and sophisticated American surveillance aircraft. One of the things that Iran did, and I think it was interesting to watch happen, is we saw sophisticated, in my opinion, it was a campaign of disinformation where Iran was trying to feed Western media the notion that a massive change in the China-Iranian relationship was in the works. There were huge numbers, the Iranian leaked information to the Western press that China was on the verge of investing $500 billion in the Iranian economy. And this was coming as Iran was pushing the West, in particular Europe, really hard to give them sanctions relief. And I think that Iran likes to create, or in the past has tried to create the impression that, if Europe in particular and the West doesn't give them a break or their economy a break, then, they're going to be pushing Iran into the hands of China. I don't think that was a particularly effective disinformation campaign, because China didn't really seem keen to support Iran in that campaign. I think that China sees Iran as sharing an interest in ending U.S. domination of the international order as they see it. And that perhaps is a shared interest with Russia as well, right? That's the common denominator that Russia, Iran, and China seem to share, is they seem to feel that American dominance on the over the international community is something that works against them and is not in their interest. And so I think that as both Iran and China find themselves marginalized or isolated as a result of various different reasons, there's a sense that they want to show that that relationship matters more. And so I think that, almost similar to the Biden visit to Saudi Arabia last summer, and the President Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia recently, I see it as much political theater as substantive. And I don't think the Iranian-China relationship is quite as robust as Iran would like people to believe. And I think that in Iran, the elites are quite scared of the possibility of China simply swallowing them up if they let them in. And so I think that from my perspective, certainly China's ability to continue to provide Iran with missile technology and supplies, and to help Iran make gains in certain critical national security areas that would potentially pose a threat to Israel, is something that needs to be watched quite closely.
Okay, I think we'll just have two more questions. John, do you have a question, right? Your hand is up. John? Oh.
I don't see that, Cynthia. Why don't you go ahead with your question?
Okay,
Yeah.
well then, I mean, thank you so much for your incredible generosity in being with us until this late hour, and really apologize for the inconvenience and everything. But I guess, again, I feel like I just keep, I'm such like a non-expert in this area. I just keep kind of, I feel like my questions are often a little naive, but again, also looking at stuff that's been in the chat, I guess a lot of people are still wanting to explore like the motivations of different oil producers. And I guess when I'm looking at like this patchwork of Middle Eastern states, and you throw Russia into the mix, I mean, you have all of these countries who don't really like one another very much, but then there's all these like, kind of alliances of convenience that seem to be like coming up and fading. And I'm just wondering, is that what it's about? I mean, is everybody just acting like in like kind of very, sort of short-term instrumentalist ways? I mean, so that like, Russia and Saudi Arabia are kind of acting together, but like Saudi Arabia and Iran don't get along, and Russia's also kind of in Iran, but also trying to, keep as good relations with Israel as they can. I mean, just again, I feel like I'm not expressing this like very well, but
is it strategy or is it opportunism, right? And
yes, and what's holding it together, or what's the give? And I guess that links to again your discussion of propaganda and fear. Is there some kind of larger sense that it's like more important to say fight the US and its efforts to, expand its share of the global oil market, or is it more important to, keep this conflict going so that Russia is forced to like sell off a lot of its stuff at like at cheaper price, and they can somehow benefit from it? I mean, I don't know. Is there a sense of like what some bottom line like important things are to this collage of different selfish nations?
Sure. I think, it's interesting. I think there is first of all, the countries, the major oil producers, I think, understand that markets are cyclical, and that this particular period is delivering for them a major windfall. And what's so amazing about this, if you follow the discourse for those Gulf producers in 2020, early 2021, when the pandemic was sort of at its peak, there was a real sense that the sky was falling in, that global oil demand would never come back to what it was pre-pandemic. And there was this big panic and rush and push to sort of, to position themselves and their countries and economies for the sort of post-oil future, and they all realized that was coming, but there was a sense that it was coming a lot faster than anyone was ready for in 2020, 21. And here we are now at the beginning of 2023, and because of the Ukraine war, it sort of turned that entire zeitgeist on its head, because now the exact opposite situation for those Gulf producers prevails. Because of the war, because of its impact on global markets, those countries in 2022 experienced huge profits that they hadn't probably seen since the 2003 Iraq War, or sort of the first decade of the 21st century. And so now they'll have a huge cushion to manage whatever energy transition and happens. And in fact, they'll be leading it because they'll have the funds available to invest in whatever the new renewables are. And we're already seeing that in Europe. I mean, one of the things that the way the Gulfs are changing their relationship with Europe is they're not just selling Europe gas, which Europe badly needs because of the war and Russia trying to weaponize gas. They're investing in the European transition to renewables. They're using their sort of Ukraine war oil profits to invest in Europe's transition to renewables. They're going to profit from it because they realize it's going to happen sooner or later. And so I think, what we're seeing is actually, I think, quite in some sense, a combination of strategy and opportunity that's quite sophisticated. And I don't think it's necessarily directed against anyone. I think it's more directed in sort of ensuring their own futures, right? And preserving their systems. And I think if you watch the Emiratis most closely, to me, what's quite interesting about the Emiratis is they're quite open, and unlike many countries in the Middle East, they seem to have a strategy and they talk about it all the time. And they're quite transparent about it. Now, we might not like it. It might not conform to what many of us identify in terms of values. But I think that in terms of understanding what it is, they're quite clear. And I think in Middle Eastern terms, that's quite rare.
So I know we said that was the last question, but I can't help but ask just one that's in the chat real quick, because it's something that comes up a lot when I talk to people. Patricia wrote, does Zelensky being the only Jewish head of state outside of Israel create any sense of kinship, or is it just seen as Ukrainian versus Russian?
That's a great question. There was a really great interview he gave to Uvda, which is one of the big Israeli, it's probably, I'm struggling for an apt comparison. It's probably the Israeli 60 Minutes. Is probably the best way to describe the show. That two of their leading journalists went to Ukraine, sat with Zelensky and interviewed him. And actually what was interesting is Zelensky normally doesn't conduct his interviews in English, if I'm not mistaken. But this one he did largely in English on Israeli television with Uvda. Which was, to me, a little bit ironic. But I think there is a sense of kinship which transcends simply he's just another state leader, right? That some might identify with because he's an underdog. And I know people have sort of made the Israel-Ukraine comparison at certain junctures in the war. So I think there is something a bit more to it. Whether the larger Israeli public sees it that way, gets back to the questions of how Israelis see their own identity. I think, you know, and again, the sort of Russian-Ukrainian divide within Israeli society, it's a complicated question. But I think that the simplest way to answer it is because he's Jewish. I think there's no doubt that Israelis tend, or at least Jewish Israelis tend to look at him differently and more than just the leader of Ukraine.
Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today. I again apologize for the interruption that we had. I'm so grateful for everybody who made their way back in. I know we lost 20 or 30 people in that transition, and that's unfortunate. We are strong believers in freedom of expression, but there are ways that one should not go about doing that, and we apologize that that happened.
Hey, and thank you though that like 80 of you came back. That's pretty extraordinary.
And stuck with us quite past our normal ending time. So just a reminder for everybody that we'll go back to 1 p.m. next week. Next week, February 24th, will be 1 year since Russia launched its invasion. We have kind of a special program scheduled. We're going to have 3 guests, including Victor Lutsishin, I think is the right pronunciation of his last name, one of Cynthia's students from Holy Cross, who many of you probably remember joined us last year. He comes from Kherson, and he joined us right after the liberation of Kherson. We also have a graduate student writing a PhD in Ukrainian history, who was in Ukraine on a Fulbright when this all started, and had to evacuate, and then ended up doing some interesting work with humanitarian organizations. He's going to join us and talk about his experiences. And we have Professor Mayhill Fowler from Stetson University, who is a professor of Ukrainian cultural history, Ukrainian theater, these kinds of things, and she's going to talk about you know, how this experience of this last year has impacted her and her work. So I think it's going to be a really great session,
especially because she's a former actress, and so she's also taught and been highly involved in the Ukrainian cultural community prior to the invasion.
Absolutely. So I think it's going to be a great session. So everybody, you know, tell your friends. Don't tell the troll to join us again. We'll work on better locking things down when we start next week, and we'll start at 1 o'clock. And I wish everybody a great week between now and then.
Thank you again, Brandon, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thanks, Cynthia and Steve, and thank you all.
Take care.